Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about literature and the arts. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Makaya Otini, and today we're speaking with Peter Gilbert. Peter's music has been included in festivals and conferences around the world, supported by artist residencies and other foundations in the US and Europe, performed by soloists of international renown, and produced in collaboration with dozens of outstanding ensembles. He's also taught at numerous colleges and universities, including Dartmouth and Harvard. We're excited to be with him today.
Thank you for tuning in. We're excited that you're here. Why don't you also subscribe, like, comment, and share this episode with your friends?
And if you know anyone who wants to come on the podcast, please do send them our way. Also, if you haven't yet, sign up for our free newsletter where we share updates, resources, and opportunities. To support the podcast, you can make a one-time donation through our website or purchase a subscription to our blog where you'll find more premium content and resources at thedatekeepers.com. Thank you for being a part of our community.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to have you. Can you tell us about yourself and what are you working on now?
Sure. I'm a composer and a teacher. I write a broad array of things that we might call classical music. I just finished an opera that I wrote with my spouse that was premiered at the Schwetzingen Festival in Germany and has been performed since at Theater Aachen. Right now, I'm just working on finishing up revisions to that. It's a 90-minute piece, and it's just, my head has been so full and so noisy with this for the past 2 years that part of my hope for the summer is just to try and have space to listen.
Wait, if your head is full of noise, listening will make it more full. We'll put more noise into your head, so you're screwed.
You need some earplugs. And it's really cool that you worked on the opera with your spouse. Is this the first project that you two have done together?
We've done quite a lot of work together over the years. We had another opera that we collaborated on several years ago, and we've done pieces for chamber ensembles as well. It's always been, I don't want to say it's been easy, but it's one of the easier collaborations that I've had in my life. Obviously, you all are in very much the same position, so I'm...
Yes.
Yep. And what is the opera about?
So it's based on a very important German novel called Malina by Ingeborg Bachmann. And it's really like a landmark of German literature and of feminist literature. It's not very well known in English, but for German-speaking countries, it's a real literary high point. It was one of the things that I think Carola and I enjoyed most about working on it, that every time there was something we didn't understand about a scene, every time we were trying to figure out where something was going, what's at the depth of a character, you would just go back to that novel, and it was this incredible source of knowledge and inspiration and poetry. It just always had the answer. Because as a composer, normally you're making something out of whole cloth. It's all about the sound. You just have to really rely on yourself to come up with what you need. And so working on an opera and having a literary source for the libretto, we had a wonderful librettist who fashioned this expansive novel into something more workable. But having that incredible literary source to always go back to was such a gift.
And what was the first time that you encountered this novel, and how many times have you read it? How has the reading changed each time that you visited it?
That's a great question. Our librettist, Tina Hartmann, who we've worked with before, had the idea of doing this. And it is a very, I would say, it's somewhere maybe between Virginia Woolf and James Joyce. It's very surreal at times. It's very stream of consciousness. It's all told from the perspective of a woman, and we never learn what her name is. She's just called Ich, which is the German word for I. And so the first time I read it, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on because sometimes things don't make sense and that's the way it's written. And sometimes, I'm trying to read it in German, my second language. So I'm thinking, I'm not reading this correctly. But sometimes that's just the way it was written. Then I read it in English translation. Of course, now having written music for it, I can't read it without the musical associations that Carola and I created for it. So now it's an entirely different kind of experience to read the text. To try and answer your question, every time we would come back to it, there would be a new kind of feeling that you would get from a moment, just because it's full of so many cycles and repetitions and echoes. So you're always discovering new kinds of relationalities. And that's one of the really exciting things about really well-written literature is that you feel like you're discovering something. It's like a Where's Waldo book. You've looked at this picture so many times, and yet there's something new here that you'd never noticed before.
And were you also reading criticism of the book alongside these recursive rereadings, or how were you enriching it?
I did look at a few brief commentaries. We had a real helping hand in that our librettist went through and shaped the text into sort of dramatic scenes and essentially made it into a theatrical work for us to render into an opera. So the job that we had was really to take that once removed version and figure out how to make that into a theatrical experience.
And can you tell us about your first time collaborating with your spouse and which one of you started it? Like if you could share the story. And how was that for the person who really didn't start it? What was the reaction?
Yeah. So as a married couple who are both creators, there is this kind of problem in that there's a lot about creating that requires you to be on your own, that requires you to kind of retreat into a safe space and do the kinds of things that you need to do to make things. So I think we figured out that when we had projects that we could do together, that made for less time that we were apart in our creation mode and more time that we could enjoy being with each other, So then when you have those projects and you're able to invite that other person into the creative process and you're not just thinking through problems, you're kind of talking through problems, you're dialoguing through them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was just like the first opportunity that came along that seemed like a thing we could do together. We seized on that. Our manner of working sort of changes project to project, but typically what it involves is we're each generating material and then we're passing that material to the next person, and then they are thinking about it or responding to it or adding layers to it, and then there's kind of a layer upon layer that goes on.
And when do you guys brainstorm projects? Is it when you're on walks or eating or what time of the day?
And also, like, how do you have, like, do you compartmentalize? Like, do you have parts of your life where you shut the work out or it just bleeds into everything?
The person that you should really ask about that is our children. and I'm sure they would tell you that there is no compartmentalization in our house. Everything is always on at all times. But actually, truthfully, because we have two great and very active kids, most of the things that we do as a couple are really just day-to-day boring logistics of getting everyone where they're supposed to be at the right time and so on. There is a fair amount of segmentation that happens kind of by default like that. And sometimes we will say like, okay, we really need to like schedule a time to talk about work. So it's a big mess. Ito, you had another question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, typically it is, when kids are at school, we both have university teaching jobs, so a lot of the workday gets taken up with those things. But yeah, we'll just kind of squeeze it in wherever we can. I'll have something that I'm working on, but I'm wondering what she's thinking, and I'll say, hey, whenever you have a minute, I have something I want to show you. And it kind of goes like that. How do you all do it?
Well, we collaborate on writing, and also now, it's like, well, we didn't have enough, so we added the podcast.
Right.
And we also have a small business. So writing together was how it started. With the writing, I think it's the easiest, right? Like we brainstorm stories. We do a lot of work that other writers do post-production before we even put anything on paper. And we do that actually even with our clients' work. With the podcast, it's too complicated. We try to divide our projects based on days and times.
Yeah, we're finally now at the point where we're actually like scheduling, okay, like this day of the week is for this and that day of the week is for that. For a long time, we weren't able to do that because just everything needed to be attended to simultaneously. But now we've got a very delicate schedule that's very easy to disrupt, but all 7 days scheduled. But yeah, we kind of know what to expect going into any given day of the week.
We are even scheduled for next year, so
yeah.
That's pretty brilliant. I think that's great. It shows real clarity and discipline. I admire that. We should aspire to have that kind of organization, but we have a lot of moving parts in our family, and so I think we've kind of held it all pretty loosely.
Okay, so when you are composing music, what are your priorities? And I'm phrasing the question like that because, like, really what I want to ask is what emotional state are you trying to elicit or what idea are you trying to process? But that's too specific a question when we're talking about a whole body of work. So what are the priorities that guide your creative practice? And maybe you can share an example of how that's manifested in one specific work. But what are the things you care most about in your music? And what are the things that maybe another composer might care about, but just for you are not as important, or you put other things in front of those as you're thinking about how to approach your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really beautifully put. I think sort of looking back on myself as a kid, I was sitting there with a slightly janky upright piano and just always having the pedal down. And what that does is it allows all the strings to constantly resonate. And I really was trying to, oh gosh, it was almost like dissolving into the sound, if that makes sense. Sometimes when I look at contemporary visual art, very prominent paintings will sometimes hit me as kind of garish, like there's almost too much color. And I tend to like things that are a little more monochrome and more muted. But it occurs to me that maybe one of the reasons someone might become an artist is because they really love that trippy experience of color striking the eye. And I think that's basically how I feel about sound. I just really like big, saturated, complex sounds. And that draws me into harmonies that tend to be a little more complex. There's a lot more kind of vibratory action happening in them. But I think probably it was already happening pretty early on that I felt kind of like a sound junkie. So I enjoy that a lot. But on the other hand, I also really love the whole broad repertoire of classical instrumental music. And one of the things that you see, especially through like the common practice period, something like Bach or Brahms, every single note on the page is so perfectly placed in a way that creates interesting relationships with everything else. And so I'm also really interested in that sense of relationship. But honestly, it's interesting because one of the things that teaching does is it shows me what my actual priorities are. One of the things I constantly am coming back to with students all the time is, where is this going? And so we're constantly looking at time and the flow of time. And in a lot of ways, music is sort of managing energy through time. That's what I spend a lot of my time on. And it's certainly what I spend a lot of time with students on, is thinking about that. I was curious how you all think about, like, how do you all decide when a story is done?
Stories are never done.
Yeah, that's the hardest part, I think.
And so I spent almost like a little bit less than half of my life just exposed to oral storytelling. And when I was a kid, I was so frustrated that my family and neighbors told the same stories over and over, and I always changed them. I guess you could call me like a developmental editor even back then, like a structural editor. Like, I was so obsessed with the fact that stories were similar. And so I wasn't exposed to books where, you get a printed book or audiobook where like the story is the same. I wasn't even exposed to traditional media, radio, nothing. It was just people telling stories next to the fire in the evening or whatever. And so when we started working together, I already had that. But like, even after our stories are published, we all the time think like, what if we did this and this and this? And that's how we come up with other stories. I mean, there are other ways, but a lot of the time we end up coming up with other stories just because we wish that story was different.
Yeah, sometimes our new stories are rewritings of old stories, but they are so extensive that nobody would know that that's what they are if they weren't there. And I think also, like, in terms of character arc, this is not the only criterion, but one of the ways, and this also says something about the types of characters we like to write, but when the characters' bad decisions have effectively boxed them in so much that they actually do not have any options left, and they're kind of in self-imposed checkmate, at that point, there's only so much farther you can go with that. That's often where we're like, okay, I think it's time to wrap this up because there's really nowhere else this character can go.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think a lot about is, you asked, like, what am I trying to do? I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is make a moment that'll resonate, so that if you go to a concert, it's still kind of lingering hours later, that you can still remember that experience of that moment. And I think it's about maybe 25% what you're doing in that exact point, and like 75% how you got there.
Sure.
Necessarily, a lot of it is working backwards from that spot. Except the thing is, like, a lot of times when you start, you don't know necessarily what that spot is. So you're doing this kind of dance where you're learning, you're researching what the material is, and you're trying to figure it out. And then at some point, that moment becomes clear, and now you have to kind of go back and reimagine or re-understand everything that happened up to there and make sure that it's really delivering you to that point.
One of the most useful metaphors that I've encountered, and I'm guessing this also applies to music too, so I'm wanting to know if this resonates.
Mm-hmm.
When you have an injury, it isn't always the injured part of you that hurts. Sometimes the injured part of you actually feels okay, and the pain shows up in the part of the body that has to take the extra load because the injured part of your body is not functioning properly, like if a muscle group or a tendon group is damaged. And sometimes in a story that's not working, the part of the story that's not working is not actually where the problem is. You need to go to some other section of the story and rework whatever set that moment up that you feel is not working. The moment that seems like it's not working actually can stay exactly as it is, but something about the context needs to change. Do you feel that that also applies to music?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. One of the things that see what you think of this, I've been kind of playing with this the past few days, is thinking about the process of the movement of story as being like water flow. And I'm just so fascinated by this kind of fractal nature of, like, a small rivulet and one of the world's biggest rivers operate with the same kind of chaotic and always changing curvatures. Just fascinating that a river can't go in a straight line. It always has to meander. But there's a sort of an essential ingredient for that water flow, which is gravity. So it has to start uphill. So there's this potential energy at the beginning of the river, and the process of the river moving is the release of that energy. I think that's kind of what you were saying about the character getting boxed in, is that there's a point at which that energy is kind of released. But then figuring out the story is kind of figuring out how to position it in such a way that it's kind of uphill, that it generates the potential for this flow. And then once it starts flowing, it's going to go somewhat unpredictably, except the only thing that's predictable is that it won't be a straight line.
Yes. That's what, there's not a whole lot of them, but the few really good sitcoms that have, like, I mean, I guess this is true of really any long form narrative, but for some reason sitcoms came to mind because I think most of them don't do this, but there's a few that do. They set up series of events that feel inevitable, no matter how contrived they actually are. Like, I'm thinking of Silicon Valley. That show is so contrived if you actually step back and think about it. It never feels that way when you're experiencing it. They've managed to create the illusion that every single event that takes place in that show was the inevitable consequence of the previous event. And setting up that illusion is a real talent. And that's what makes a story work, I think, is when no matter what the reader thinks, if they feel that what is happening is the only possible way that that narrative could have unfolded, and they're in the water and they're being borne along by it. I mean, as readers, we are always not floating on the surface of the water, but we're actually in the water. We're down there. We're being borne along by the current. And we can't see the shape of the river until we've been taken to the end point and we've stepped out of it and we look back at what we just passed through.
Yeah, and I think one of the really curious things about it is that, at least for me, there's one fundamental ingredient that goes into making a piece something that feels like it's worth doing. And for me, that's discovery. So that means that at the beginning of the process, the thing that's most important is a thing that I completely don't know and, in fact, don't understand. So for a lot of the creative process, I'm also in the river. And then at some point, I am able to kind of like also have this bird's eye view. And then, like a real river, sometimes the path of the river will change as a result of that kind of broader understanding. But there's a real kind of back and forth there.
This is something, I don't know if this is true for you too, but this is something that I think is different about working with a collaborator is, in our case, we dig the riverbed first.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes the river will redirect itself and the shape of the story will change. But we do a lot of that work up front. And that's what Ito mentioned earlier, that instead of waiting to find out where the story will take us, we give it that direction in advance. Do you do that with your collaborators too?
Yeah, I don't know how much is all completely laid out in advance, but definitely the process of collaborating means that you are verbally articulating a lot of things that if you were working solo might be in your head and might be present, but might not have as much clarity as is required to like share it with another person.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that it changes the timing of those discoveries to a certain degree. But I think that aspect of not knowing and discovering is still very much there. You're just talking through it with someone.
It just happens earlier in the process, yeah.
Or I tell him something that I experienced back in Morocco, and he just is like, oh my God, is that real? And I'm like, well, yeah, but let's write it in fiction.
One of the things I have discovered for myself, and I've talked with my students about, is being uncomfortable is really interesting because there's something real happening there. There's something like undeniable at play. And like, as a musician, being on stage, it's not comfortable. You've got all these people looking at you. You could screw up. It's really provocative and exciting. And I think the danger is great.
Yes.
I never watched any Hollywood or fun stuff back in Morocco. 28 years of my life I spent, watching, hearing, and seeing things that are so gross. And, we had a story accepted a few weeks ago. And the editors said, remove this. I think it was a couple scenes.
Because it was fairly graphic descriptions of violence.
And I said, no, thank you. Like, that's real stuff that happened. And to me, even though I call it fiction, that's reality. And if your readers are not comfortable with that, then let's write some stories about flowers and find another writer to do that, not me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the really profound experiences of my life was reading Virginia Woolf, and it was just a passage, kind of a throwaway line, but it just lined up so much with a thought that I had had, but it was like a very private thought, like not a thing that I would ever tell anyone that I had thought. And I thought it was so crazy. Not that she had had the same thought, but that she put it in a book and put her name on it. I thought that's wild.
No, it's not correct. I mean, I've met a lot of good people in this world, but I think it's really good to write about the dark side of human beings, Like, was it Schopenhauer who says, my freedom stops when others' freedom begins? And when you are alone, you behave in a crazy way that people don't know. And I saw that. I saw people behaving in a crazy way. And, people should read to see. It's like reading should be like a mirror where you see your real self, not your fictional self that you show people at work or in, conferences or whatever.
Yeah.
Double life is something we live. And in reading, we should see our real selves.
The intimacy is really the thing. I mean, it's what makes relationships special. The trust that you have to share something intimate makes a relationship more profound. And writers do this all the time. They're sharing this intimacy, and it's both. I mean, I always say that there's one sentence you can say to get everyone in the room listening, and that's, I shouldn't tell you this, but... And as soon as you say that, everyone wants to know. And I feel like that's basically what writers do. They just sit down and say, I shouldn't tell you this, but, and then there's the story.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
And as a musician, we have this kind of safety, like we kind of hide behind the notes. But it is very much what we're trying to do when we compose too. It's trying to find those feelings and render those I shouldn't tell you this, but kind of moments of life experience. And you're just rendering them in sound instead of words. But it's definitely safer than what you all do, which I find incredibly brave and noble.
Hey, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for making the time. We really appreciate you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed reading your all's work. It's really, every single piece is totally new and different and unfolding a new world. So I'm excited to see what you all do next.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and stay in touch.
Likewise. Bye.
Take care.
Take care, Peter.
Bye.
Bye-bye.